into eastern and southeastern Ukraine. This is not an isolated action, but part of a dangerous pattern over many months to destabilize Ukraine as a sovereign nation.
NATO's Secretary General today slamming Russia and backing Ukraine's sovereignty. Right now, the international hotspot, eastern Ukraine. Hello, everyone. I'm Bazi Kanani in Washington. The fighting intensifying in cities in eastern Ukraine as rebel forces are now pushing back the Ukrainian army. And while NATO says it fully supports Ukraine, it became extremely hesitant on the Ukrainian Prime Minister's request to join NATO. The BBC's Nick Childs has more on the crisis in Ukraine.
Pro-Russian rebels continue a fight back against Ukrainian government troops after weeks in which they've been forced onto the defensive. This is unverified footage. But significantly, Kiev and the West say this fight back has been fortified by escalating Russian military involvement, prompting an emergency meeting of NATO ambassadors.
Today, we expressed strong solidarity with Ukraine. At the Wales summit next week, we will meet President Poroshenko to make clear NATO's unwavering support for Ukraine.
But how far will that support go? The Ukrainian Prime Minister has just said that his government would ask Parliament to seek NATO membership. The NATO response, a cautious one, that it respects Kiev's decision. And the word from Washington, the response to Russia is not military, but diplomatic.
Russia is already more isolated than at any time since the end of the Cold War. Capital is fleeing, investors are increasingly staying out, its economy is in decline, and this ongoing Russian incursion into Ukraine will only bring more costs and consequences for Russia.
EU leaders meeting in Brussels this weekend will now look at tougher sanctions against Russia following this new turn in the crisis. But how effective can they be, given the stakes in this for the Kremlin? The new satellite imagery that NATO says shows Russian combat forces in and around eastern Ukraine. Moscow still denies any such involvement. A defiant rally by Ukrainian loyalists in the southeastern town of Mariupol, suddenly under threat from the latest rebel successes. Their opinion of the Russian President Vladimir Putin clear enough. But in his latest remarks, the Russian leader has responded with a Nazi analogy of his own, accusing Kiev of an assault in eastern Ukraine reminiscent of the siege of Leningrad in World War II. The wreckage and the costs of this conflict in Ukraine and beyond are plain to see. A way out of it, however, seems as elusive as ever. Nick Childs, BBC News.
And we are joined now by ABC News international affairs correspondent Hamish MacDonald in Kiev today. Hamish, Ukraine says it wants to join NATO, but does it make it less likely that it would actually be accepted into that group of allied nations, given the unrest in the country right now and the fighting with Russia?
Yes, absolutely it does. And there's a very simple, straightforward reason for that. Under the NATO alliance, there is a mutual defence pact, and that means that NATO member states would be obliged, if Ukraine was a member, to act to defend them in the case of an invasion. Given that there is certainly an argument that Russia is in the process of invading Ukraine, if not quite a lot of evidence to support that theory as well. That means that NATO member states would be approaching this request very cautiously. It's not the first time that we've been in this sort of situation where Ukraine has tried to press forward with NATO membership. This has happened before. They didn't quite get there, but certainly the Prime Minister Yatsenyuk is saying that a bill is to go before the Parliament. It'll be voted on. Essentially what that will change is Ukraine's position effectively as a non-aligned state. At the moment, there's legislation, in fact, it's in the Constitution, preventing Ukraine from joining blocs, from joining unions, for example, like the European Union or the NATO alliance.